Hi, I'm Jardar. This is The Catch. Lobsters are one of our favorite summer foods, and eating them is always a social affair. And pricing can be quite volatile, which makes them great for traders like me. There's also a big price difference between old shell and new shell lobsters. We're back in Bremen, Maine with our favorite lobster fisherman, Fernie Poland, to look into the difference between a hard shell and a new shell lobster.
Everybody knows that lobsters grow by shedding their old shell. The old shell falls off and they have a new one underneath. The new shell is expanded and it's had enough time to harden up. You can see on this lobster, I can't even squeeze that shell. Sometimes you can squeeze these like they're almost like paper. And that's not a good lobster. It's a challenge for me every year because you have to gauge the shell quality and the meat quality and the yield of the lobster versus the price. And it varies every year. Some years we don't switch over to a new shell until September because the shells don't harden up soon enough and the meat doesn't fill out soon enough. This year we've been very lucky. The shells got really hard, really fast. This is new shell, I can barely squeeze it, and the yield is really good. So this year we switched over in the first week of July, which is really, really early. And the price difference is huge. Hard shell lobster, when you open up this claw, it's going to be filled with meat all the way out, and it's all the way to the shell is going to be meat. This new shell, when you crack it, there's going to be a lot of water in there. And that water is what you're paying for that water at the per pound price of lobster. Now the benefit to the new shell lobster is that that meat is much more tender and it's much sweeter. Hard shell meat sometimes can be too full, that the tail can be tough, and the claw, while it's nice and firm, sometimes can get a bit grainy. And the flavor sometimes is not as good, and there's always a balance. And sometimes we can push it a little bit too far with a hard shell, where people start complaining that the meat was tough, or it didn't have the right flavor. And a lot of times, this is a new shell, and you can see how orange it is here along this part of the shell. On an old shell lobster, that's going to be black, and it'll remain black after it cooks. And sometimes people think there's something wrong with that lobster because it's black on the shell, but it's not. That's just the nature of it, and that's how it cooks up. Even though these have some water, these should yield somewhere between 17 and 18% meat. A hard shell would be about 22 to 24%. So we need to always weigh the cost of the lobster versus the yield to see which is the better deal. You know, if this had a really soft shell, it might only be 10% meat. And if that's $2 less a pound, you're actually paying more for the meat. So in the end, the harder this shell is, generally speaking, the more meat you're going to get out of the lobster. So even when we receive these at Nordic Fish, we'll take all these lobsters and we gauge the shell quality ourselves. We only put the hardest shells in the tank to sell to the customer to take home. We keep the softest shells ourselves to pick for meat. It's not the best deal for us, it's a better deal for you, but it also gives us very sweet meat for our world-class lobster rolls.
So we're going to cook both hard shell and new shell lobsters today, and we're going to open them up, and we're going to see what the real difference is inside. As we talked about on the boat, a new shell lobster is going to have a little give to the shell, because this is the new shell. A hard shell lobster, you can't even squeeze it. We're going to find that these are really filled all the way out to the shell with meat. Every year I struggle with when to switch over from a hard shell to a new shell lobster because there's that balance between price, meat quality, and shell quality. Whereas you get the higher yield out of the hard shell lobster, the meat at some point starts to get a little bit tough and it's not as sweet. And a lot of times people don't understand the difference in the pricing. If they're paying $17 versus $9, well, one sounds cheaper, but that's not necessarily the case. In the end, the meat price ends up costing about the same. It all comes down to what type of meat you like. I like an old shell claw because it's a bit firmer, where the new shells can sometimes have a kind of a stringy and thin claw. But the knuckles and the tails are super sweet and really tender. So they make a great lobster roll. Also at Nordic, when we get the new shells, we pick out the softest shells to make our own meat with. So you're getting a better value out of the new shell lobster you get from us, as opposed to ones you might get elsewhere. Remember, we want to steam lobsters, not boil them. So we're only using about 1 inch of salted water. This way the lobsters don't get submerged. When you submerge them, they're actually going to cook slower, and they're also going to soak up some water, and it's going to compromise the flavor. So once that water comes to a boil, we simply put the lobsters in the pot. Always try to get the tails to tuck under. So with the lobsters in the pot and the water boiling, we're going to cover it, and we're going to let it cook for 10 minutes. That's the perfect amount of time to steam them. It's been 10 minutes, and the lobsters are ready. We can tell because they're completely red. There you can see a nice red lobster. It's cooked all the way through. We're going to give these a little time to chill, and I'm going to show you. I'm going to crack and split and pick them and show you the difference in the meat. So this is a new shell lobster. This one's very soft. This is nothing that I would ever sell as whole to a customer. This is something I would use for meat. The yield is just too low to sell. It's most noticeable in the claw. And it's so soft that we don't even need a knife to open it with. And you notice all the water that just ran out of there. That's water that you're paying for by weight as lobster. Now I can just open this by hand. This is what we mean by low yield. Look at all the space inside that claw. However, this meat is incredibly sweet. It's really just has such a sweet, sweet flavor to it. And it's very, very tender. My favorite part of the lobster is here in the knuckle. Usually these are very difficult to open, but with a soft new shell lobster, it just comes out as one nice little nugget like that. That's the most tender part of the lobster. This is our hard shell lobster. You can see that this shell has no give to it, especially here in the claw. You can't even push that in at all. You notice that the edge of the claw is black. Sometimes people react to that and feel that the lobster may have been burned or that it's not completely cooked. This will never turn red no matter how long you cook it. As we saw in the claw, the new shell lobster, this is the same. See how little water came out of that? There's almost no water in there. And I can't break this by hand. I need to do this with a knife. So we're going to hit it right in the sweet spot. Get one nice clean crack on that shell. And you'll see there's no space in there at all. That claw meat fills out all the way to the shell. The claw meat doesn't tend to get tough, but this might be a little bit grainier. So look at the size of that claw. It's as big as the shell. It's really good. It has a different flavor to it. Sometimes the old shell lobster can almost have a smokiness to the meat. It's very subtle, but you can really taste it. It's not quite as sweet, but it has kind of a richer flavor. Now let's look at the tails. Let's start with our new shell lobster. And you can see that the tail is pretty filled out. There's not a lot of room in the tail, so the tails fill out pretty quickly. So you do get a good yield out of the tail. And that tail is firm, but still tender and really sweet. Then it has a delicious flavor to it. Now let's look at the hard shell tail. It's much, much fuller. It takes a little more work to open. It's not too hard to deal with. And you can see how springy that is. Where the new shell tail would kind of hold out straight, this springs right back. And it definitely has a much firmer and meatier texture to it. And it's getting late, so these, you can see it's not breaking apart quite as easy. And it definitely has almost a toughness to it as we get so late in the season. And the flavor is not as sweet. It's a bit more smoky and a bit meatier. So now we're going to look at a higher quality new shell. This is what we would sell out of the tank to a customer to take home or to cook for them. And even though there's still going to be a lot of water in here, you can see there was a good amount of water that came out. It's still very full. Not quite as full as the old shell. It's not filled all the way out, but it's got a nice, plump, and full claw. And this meat has that delicious sweetness without the smokiness you get in the hard shell lobster. And the tail, it's not quite as springy as the hard shell was. It's got a little bit more give to it. Sometimes the new shell will actually you can even just hold them out straight because they're so tender. And see how easy that breaks up? It's almost effortless. And it's really sweet. So it's really hard to find that balance every year of yield to sweetness to shell quality that's perfect. So we just have to, every year, take a look at them. We buy a lot of lobsters, we check them out, and we make sure that everybody's getting the best deal. So in the end, we find that new shells are much, much sweeter, but have a lower yield. So sometimes the lower price of the new shell does not translate into a lower cost for meat. It ends up to be about the same. Thanks so much for watching. I'm Jardar, and this is The Catch. Come and visit me at Nordic Fish in Fairfield, Connecticut for the world's best seafood.